The wagon wheel groaned, a sound as dry and brittle as the Kansas prairie itself. For Ilara, that sound was her life. 4 months a widow, 6 weeks from being destitute, and every day a battle against the choking dust that settled on everything, especially the pale, gaunt faces of her 2 children, Thomas and little May. The rancher, Mr. Silas Croft, owned the only creek in 50 miles, and his price for water was rising faster than the summer heat. He'd offered to buy her land for pennies, his gaze lingering on her cabin with a predatory patience. Ilara had prayed for rain, for a miracle, for anything. What she got was fire. A wall of orange flame swept across the plains, an apocalypse in grass. She and the children barely survived, huddled in the dry creek bed near her cabin. When the smoke cleared, their world was a blackened, nightmarish landscape. Everything was gone. Her meager crops, the small barn, the last of her hope. It was only as she stood on the charred hillside, tears carving clean lines through the soot on her face, that she saw it. A thin, impossible wisp of steam rising from a cluster of scorched rocks. Her husband, rest his soul, had never bothered to clear. Tell me in the comments what city you're watching this story from. I'd love to know how far these exciting stories are reaching. And if you've ever experienced an inexplicable situation, share it with us. The wagon wheel groaned, a sound as dry and brittle as the Kansas prairie itself. For Ilara, that sound was her life. 4 months, a widow, 6 weeks from being destitute, and every day a battle against the choking dust that settled on everything, especially the pale, gaunt faces of her 2 children, Thomas and little May. The sod cabin, dug into the slight rise of the unforgiving land, was a tomb of failed dreams. Her husband, Daniel, was buried just over that rise, taken not by a sudden bullet or a strike of lightning, but by the slow, grinding death of overwork and pneumonia. He had coughed his lungs out in the dead of winter, his final breaths rattling with the same dust that now coated his children's eyelashes. Daniel had believed in this land. He saw wheat where Ilara saw only brittle, brown grass. He saw a future where Ilara saw only an endless, oppressive sky. Now his belief was a debt, a piece of paper in a locked box that tied her to this place, and tied this place to the bank in town, which was, in all practical terms, simply an extension of Mr. Silas Croft. Silas Croft. The name tasted like ash in her mouth, even before the fire. He was a man built of the same hard, unyielding material as the prairie. His own ranch, the Sea Bar, spread over the valley like a stain, controlling the only reliable water source for 50 miles, the Bitter Creek. His cattle grew fat. His men were paid. His house was made of wood, brought in by rail. He had visited her a month after Daniel's funeral. He hadn't removed his hat. He'd stood in the doorway, his shadow falling long across the dirt floor, blocking the only light. "Ma'am," he'd said, his voice a low rumble, "this is no place for a woman alone. The land's gone fallow. The notes due." "I'll find a way, Mr. Croft," Ilara had replied, her voice small but her spine straight. "Find a way? The only way out here is water, and God in his wisdom gave that to me." He gestured to her well, a shallow, hand-dug hole that yielded nothing but mud thick enough to plaster walls. "I'll give you $10 for the acreage. It's more than fair. It'll get you and the young'uns back east on the train." "We are not leaving," 9-year-old Thomas had said, stepping out from behind her skirts holding a broken piece of kindling like a rifle. Croft had actually laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "The boy has spirit, ashamed to see it break. My offer stands, till the bank says otherwise, ma'am, but the prairie, it don't wait for no one." His patience was the most terrifying thing about him. He wasn't a wolf, circling and snarling. He was a vulture, perched on a dead branch, waiting. He knew she had no seed to plant, no food to last, and no water to drink. He knew her failure was as certain as the sunrise. Every day was a testament to that failure. The children's bellies were distended, their arms thin as twigs, Little May, only 5, had a persistent dry cough that echoed Daniel's last days. Ilara's own meals had shrunk to a spoonful of watery cornmeal, taken only to keep her on her feet. Hope was a luxury she had burned for kindling long ago. She operated on muscle memory, on the primal instinct that demanded she see her children wake up one more time. She had prayed for rain, for a miracle, for anything to break the monotony of the dust and the hunger. What she got was fire. It came from the west, a dark smudge on the horizon that, for a day, she mistook for the storm clouds she'd begged for. But this cloud didn't smell of ozone and rain. It smelled of hell, a wall of orange flame, leaping 50 feet into the air, swept across the plains, an apocalypse in grass. It moved faster than a horse could gallop, a roaring, deafening monster that consumed everything. To the cellar! Ilara screamed, grabbing May while Thomas snatched the water jug, the one they filled with Croft's expensive, brackish water every 3 days. They didn't have a cellar, not a proper one. Daniel had called it a root cellar. But it was just a dugout, a shallow pit covered with thick sod and timber beams, smelling of damp earth and potatoes that had long since rotted. They scrambled inside, pulling the heavy door closed. For hours, the world above them ceased to exist, replaced by a terrifying symphony. The roar of the fire was a physical weight, pressing down on them, shaking the very earth. The air grew thick and hot, impossible to breathe. Ilara tore a strip from her petticoat, soaked it with their precious water, and held it over May's mouth. Thomas huddled beside her, his body rigid with a terror that was beyond tears. Ilara held them, her eyes wide open in the pitch black, convinced this was their grave. She thought of Daniel. Had he suffered this much, fighting for air? The heat was unbearable. The timbers above them groaned. This wasn't a miracle. This was an execution. The roaring stopped first. It didn't fade. It simply passed, like a freight train vanishing into the distance, leaving a ringing, profound silence in its wake. The heat, however, remained. It was a thick, oppressive blanket. "Is it over, Ma?" Thomas whispered, his voice cracking. "We wait," Ilara said, her own throat raw. "We wait for the air to cool. Don't open the door." They waited for what felt like a day. It may have been 2 hours. When Ilara finally put her hand to the wooden door, it was still hot to the touch, but not scorching. With Thomas helping, she pushed it open, just a crack. The air that filtered in was not the clean prairie air she remembered. It was thick with acrid smoke and the smell of roasted earth. It was breathable, barely. "Stay here," she commanded, her voice firm. "Do not come out until I say." She pushed the door open and climbed the packed earth steps. The world she emerged into was gone. The sun was a blood-red demonic eye, staring through a sky that was a uniform, choking gray. The vibrant blue, the endless horizon, the golden grasses, all of it had been erased. In its place was a blackened, nightmarish landscape. It was a flat, limitless desert of ash. Everything was gone, her meager withered crops, the small, rickety barn that housed a single, now-deceased chicken, the outhouse, the clothesline. Even the wooden cross on Daniel's grave had been vaporized, leaving only a dark smudge on the baked earth. The cabin itself, being made of sod, had survived, but it looked like a terrified molehill in a sea of desolation. Ilara stood there, her body numb, her mind refusing to process the scale of the destruction. There was no food, no shelter for the coming winter, no hope. Croft had been right. The prairie didn't wait. She began to walk aimlessly, her worn boots kicking up little puffs of gray ash. She was a ghost in a landscape of death. Tears carved clean lines through the soot on her face. This was it. This was the end. She would have to take the children, walk the 12 miles to Croft's ranch and beg. Beg for his $10. Beg for a ride to the station. Beg for the end of her life as she knew it. She walked to the rise, to where Daniel's grave had been. She stumbled, her foot catching on something hard beneath the layer of ash. It was a ridge of rocks, a small, jagged outcropping that Daniel had always cursed. He'd meant to clear it with dynamite, but he'd never had the money for the powder. She fell to her knees, the sharp rocks biting through the fabric of her skirt. She put a hand down to steady herself and cried out. A sharp, intense heat. She pulled her hand back, expecting to see a blister, but it wasn't a hot coal, it was wet. She stared, uncomprehending. She brushed the thick soot away from the rock. There, in a deep crevice, was a small puddle of water, no bigger than her hand, and from it, a thin, impossible wisp of steam rose into the cold, smoky air. Her heart stopped. The fire. The immense, all-consuming heat of the prairie fire had baked the earth, but it had also, in this one exact spot, done something else. It had fractured the rock. It had opened a vein. She dipped her fingers into the tiny pool. The water was warm, almost hot, but it was clear. She brought her fingers to her lips. It was sweet. Not the alkaline-laced mud from her well, not the brackish, cattle-fouled water from Croft's Creek. It was clean. She began to dig, frantically, with her bare hands, ignoring the sharp edges of the stone that cut her palms. She tore at the earth, pulling away loose rocks and handfuls of ash. The wisp of steam became a steady plume. The puddle became a trickle, a tiny, miraculous, secret trickle of water bubbling up from the heart of the earth. It wasn't a river, it wasn't a gushing spring. It was a small, quiet, persistent thing. It was just enough. It was a secret. Her grief, her despair, her numbness, it all vanished, replaced by a new, cold, and razor-sharp emotion. It was a feeling she hadn't had since Daniel died. It was hope. But it was a different kind of hope. It wasn't the soft, optimistic belief of her husband. It was a hard, fierce, animal thing. It was the hope of a mother who had just been given a weapon. She looked back toward the sod cabin, a tiny mound in the vast gray emptiness. Then she looked west, toward the unseen, sprawling ranch of Silas Croft. He owned all the water in the valley, or so he thought. The secret of the water changed the very axis of Alara's world. Her life was instantly cleaved in two. The desolate, visible performance of failure for the outside world, and the covert, desperate labor of survival. Her first act was one of concealment. Before she even fetched the children, she used the soot and ash to cover her bleeding hands. She took a burnt piece of timber and dragged it over the rocks, covering the small, steaming trickle, creating a makeshift, natural-looking lid. It was a flimsy disguise, but in the ruined landscape it was enough. She retrieved Thomas and May, her face a mask of the same despair she'd worn before. "The Lord has seen fit to test us," she said, her voice hollow, and she was not entirely lying. The walk back to the cabin was a funeral march. That night she enacted the second part of her plan. She waited until the children were asleep, their exhausted bodies finally succumbing to the trauma of the day. Then she slipped out into the moonless, smoke-filled night. She took Daniel's shovel and a pickaxe. At the hidden spring she worked with a silent, frantic energy. The ground was hard, but the fire had loosened the topsoil. She began to dig, not at the spring itself, but beside it, following the slight depression in the land. She was creating a cistern, a hidden basin where the water could collect, shielded from the sun, hidden from view. For a week this became her new routine. By day, she was the grieving widow, sifting through the ruins of her life, salvaging a bent pot, a scorched blanket. She would walk the long 2 miles to Bitter Creek, her yoke on her shoulders, and pay Croft's man for her meager 2 buckets, just as she always had. She made a show of it, letting him see her exhaustion, letting him hear her daughter's cough. "You should take Mr. Croft's offer, ma'am," the ranch hand, a young man named Jeb, said, his eyes filled with a pity that stung more than contempt. "This land is cursed." "Perhaps," Ilara would murmur, pay her nickel and turn away. But by night, she was a different creature. She was a tunneler, a sapper, a secret keeper. The darkness was her ally. She used the burnt rocks from the fire to line the basin, creating a small, stone-lined pool about 3 feet deep. She camouflaged the entire area with fallen, charred branches, creating a dense thicket that looked like nothing more than a pile of fire debris. The water itself was a miracle. It was warm, which meant it was coming from deep, unaffected by the surface drought. It flowed slowly but steadily. In a full night, her hidden cistern would fill with about 20 gallons of clean, life-giving water. She had to teach the children the secret. This was the hardest part. She sat Thomas down, his face now losing its pale, gaunt look. "Thomas," she said, gripping his shoulders, "I'm going to tell you something, and you can never, ever repeat it. Not to Mr. Croft, not to his men, not even in your prayers. Do you understand me?" He nodded, his eyes wide with the gravity of her tone. She took him to the spring. She showed him how to move the brush, how to dip the bucket without making a sound, how to cover their tracks. "But Ma," he whispered, staring at the pool, "it's ours." "Daniel, Pa always said the land was ours." "What's ours is what we can keep, Thomas," she said, her voice hard. "And we keep this by never speaking of it. Mr. Croft believes we are starving. He believes we are thirsty. We must let him believe this. Our life depends on his belief. When you go to the creek, you complain of the walk. You look tired. You understand?" He was 9 years old, but in that moment he became a man. He nodded. "Yes, Ma, I understand. We're spies." "We're survivors," she corrected. The change was slow but undeniable. Ilara began to work in the hidden canyon, a small, deep ravine carved by ancient water, now exposed by the fire. It was invisible from the plains. Using the precious water from her spring, transported 1 bucket at a time, she started a small, hidden garden. She traded her mother's locket, the last object of value she possessed, in town, not for food but for seeds, beans, squash, potatoes. The warm water from the spring, combined with the ash-rich soil, created a microclimate, a tiny Eden in the midst of hell. While the rest of the prairie lay dormant and scorched, her small patch of green began to thrive, hidden by the canyon walls. The children's health returned. The sallow, gray tint left their skin. May's cough disappeared, soothed by the clean water and the squash she ate, roasted over a small, smokeless fire in the ravine. Thomas's arms filled out, and he helped Ilara build a small, hidden fence of burnt timber to keep out any wandering animals. Outwardly, their lives were unchanged. The cabin remained a ruin. Ilara still wore her soot-stained dress. She still made her dutiful, painful walk to Croft's Creek. But now, it was a performance. The exhaustion she feigned was real, but it was from hard work, not from despair. The nickel she paid for water she no longer needed was the price of her deception. It was the best money she had ever spent. For 2 months, the deception held. Winter was approaching, and with it, a cold, biting wind that promised a hard season. Ilara's hidden garden had yielded a small but vital harvest. Potatoes, beans, and tough winter squash were hidden beneath the floorboards of her cabin, packed in the dry ash, safe from frost and rodents. The cistern was full. For the first time, Ilara believed they might actually survive. But survival breeds confidence, and confidence can be seen. Silas Croft had not been by since the fire. He had sent his man Jeb to check on her, a visit that was nothing more than a new, lower offer for the land, which Ilara had quietly refused. Croft was patient. He was waiting for the first snow, for the true bite of winter to do his work for him. He finally rode over himself on a cold, gray November afternoon. He didn't ride alone. Jeb and another man, a hard-eyed stranger, flanked him. Ilara saw them coming from a mile off. Inside, she hissed to Thomas and May, who were playing near the cabin. They vanished, the practiced obedience of co-conspirators. Elara stepped out onto her threshold, wiping her hands on her apron. She had been careful, but had she been careful enough? "Mrs. Hayes," Croft said, not dismounting. His horse, a fine tall black, stomped nervously. Croft's eyes were not on her. They were scanning the burnt land, the repaired sod roof, the small, sturdy chimney from which a thin but steady wisp of smoke was rising. "Mr. Croft," Elara said, her voice even, "a cold day for a ride." "It is," he said. His gaze fell from the chimney to her. His eyes narrowed just slightly. "You're looking, well, ma'am, for a woman who's been through the fire." "The Lord provides," Elara said, her hand clutching the door frame. Croft's lip curled. "Does he? I was not aware the Lord was in the business of charity out here. I thought that was my department." His gaze drifted to the cabin door, where little May's face had peeked out for a second, her cheeks rosy and full, not the pale, sunken face he'd expected. "The children," he said, "they look healthy, almost fed." "We manage," Elara said, her heart a cold stone in her chest. "We are frugal." "Frugal," Croft repeated. He dismounted, a slow, deliberate movement. He was a large man, and he seemed to fill the entire landscape. He walked over to her well, the dry one, and kicked a stone into it. They all heard it thud at the bottom, a dry, final sound. "Still dry," he noted, stating the obvious. He walked to her rain barrel, which was empty, its staves cracked. "Still no rain?" He turned to her, his eyes pinning her. "And yet you thrive. You walk to my creek, you buy your 2 buckets. But 2 buckets doesn't make for rosy cheeks, Mrs. Hayes. It doesn't make for a fire in the hearth. It doesn't give a widow the strength to refuse my generous offer time and time again." "I am not refusing, Mr. Croft. I am considering." "No," he said, stepping closer. She could smell the tobacco on his breath. "You're lying. I've been a fool. I've been waiting for a sparrow to starve, and what I've got here is a hawk." He turned to his men. "Jeb, you ride the perimeter. Find her tracks. She's stealing. She must be." "Sir," Jeb said, looking uncomfortable, "she's just a widow." "She is a thief," Croft roared, his civility vanishing. "She is stealing my water, the water I own, and she is making a fool of me. Find out how." Jeb nodded, his face grim, and spurred his horse. The other man dismounted and began to walk toward the ruins of the barn. "You can't," Elara said, her voice trembling, but not with fear, with rage. "I can," Croft said. "This is my valley, everything in it, the grass, the dirt, the water. It's all mine, one way or another. I'll find it." Elara's mind raced. The spring was hidden, her tracks were covered, but the garden in the ravine. It was the only thing that broke the pattern of the landscape. She had to lead him away. "There's nothing to find," she said, stepping back into the cabin, "unless you mean to search my home." Croft smiled a predator's smile. "As you wish." He pushed past her into the tiny, one-room cabin. He saw the children, huddled in the corner. He saw the small pile of firewood. And then he saw the floorboards. One of them was newer than the others, a piece of salvaged timber. He pointed. "Move." Elara didn't move. The man with him, the hard-eyed one, pushed her aside. He jammed a crowbar from his saddlebag under the plank and pried it up. There, in the dark, ash-filled space, was her winter cache, 6 large, healthy winter squash, a burlap sack bulging with dried beans, another, smaller sack of potatoes. Croft stared. Then he began to laugh, a deep, booming, terrible laugh. "Frugal, Mrs. Hayes? Frugal? This is a harvest. This is a feast. You've been holding out." "It's just what I saved," Elara stammered. "Saved from what? The fire? No, you grew this. You grew this with water, my water." Just then, Jeb returned, his horse at a gallop. Mr. Croft, sir, you've got to see this. Over the rise, by the rocks, Daniel Hayes was always cursing. Croft's smile became positively beatific. Show me, he said. He grabbed Alara by the arm. No, you show me. You, me, and the children. We'll all go see your little miracle. He dragged her out of the cabin, with Thomas and May scrambling behind, crying. He marched her over the rise, past Daniel's unmarked grave, to the pile of burnt timber and rocks. Well? Croft demanded. Alara said nothing. The hard-eyed man took the shovel and, with one heave, scattered the brush that covered the cistern. The afternoon sun glinted off the surface of the water, a pool of clean, clear, impossible water. Croft stared. He dipped his hand in, tasted it. Sweet Jesus, he whispered. Then he looked at Alara, and his eyes were no longer human. They were the eyes of a zealot who had just found his holy land. You, he seethed. You sat on this. You let me think. This is mine. No, Alara said, her voice quiet. What? No, she said again, louder, pulling her arm from his grasp. It is not. It's on my land, he roared. This whole valley is my land. Is it? Alara said. She pointed to a small, half-melted, fire-scarred piece of metal driven into the ground, just on the other side of the spring. That is the survey marker. My husband, Daniel, he showed it to me. This is the northwest corner of our property. This spring, it's on my land. Croft stared at the marker. He knew. He knew the lines better than anyone. He knew, in that instant, that she was right. It was on her property. By 20 feet. His face turned purple. It doesn't matter. The water, it feeds my creek. You're upstream. You're stealing from my source. This is a spring, Mr. Croft. It comes from the earth. It goes where it goes, but it starts here, on my land. I'll have the bank foreclose, he snarled. On what grounds? I intend to pay my note. With what? Vegetables? He mocked. With water, Mr. Croft, Alara said. The world went silent. The only sound was the wind whistling through the charred rocks. You can't be serious. I have water, you have cattle, lots of them. And your creek, it's been running low this year, hasn't it? I hear it's brackish. Croft's face was a mask of disbelief and fury. This woman, this starving, skeletal widow was trying to negotiate with him. I will ruin you, he whispered, his voice deadly. I will fence you in. I will see you and your children starve, right on top of your puddle. You could, Alara said, and for the first time she smiled, a cold, hard smile. But winter is coming, and your cattle are thirsty, and I am the only other water in the valley. Now if you'll excuse me, I have to make dinner. She turned her back on him. She took Thomas by the hand. She took May by the hand. And she walked back to her cabin, leaving Silas Croft standing alone, staring at 20 gallons of water that, for the first time in his life, he could not have. Silas Croft did not leave. He stood at the spring, unmoving. For a full hour, Alara watched him from the dirty window of her cabin. He was a statue of pure, distilled rage. He was calculating. He was a man who had built an empire on the simple principle that he was the only one with a vital resource, and that principle had just been shattered by a widow and a puddle. Finally, he mounted his horse. He and his men rode off, not back to his ranch but toward town. He's going to the bank, Ma, Thomas said, his voice flat. He's going to take the land. Let him, Alara said, pulling the children close. We've done all we can. Now we wait. They didn't sleep that night. Every gust of wind sounded like horsemen. Every shadow was a threat. Alara held Daniel's old, unloaded shotgun in her lap, a useless bluff, but it made her feel better. The next day passed in a fog of terrified silence, and the next. On the third day, a wagon appeared on the horizon, not Croft's stallion. A buckboard, driven by a single man. It was Jeb, Croft's ranch hand. He drove up to the cabin and stopped, not getting down. He looked pale and tired. "Ma'am," he said, staring at his hands. Ilara stepped out. "Jeb. Mr. Croft, he sends his regards." Jeb winced, as if the word was painful. "He was at the bank. He talked to the judge. He tried to claim the water rights. He tried to claim your land was forfeit." Ilara's blood ran cold. "And?" Jeb looked up, and his eyes held a grudging, astonished respect. "And the banker, Mr. Harris, told him you had already been in." Ilara stared. "2 months ago," Jeb continued, as if reciting a story he'd been forced to memorize, "you came in, paid the interest on your note, with a gold locket, and you filed a water rights claim for a newly discovered artesian spring. Mr. Harris, he laughed about it. Thought you were, pardon me, ma'am, thought you were mad. He filed it as a courtesy to your late husband." Ilara had forgotten. In her trade for seeds, she had seen Mr. Harris, the banker. She had paid the small interest, and on a whim, on a fierce, desperate what-if, she had asked him to file the claim. She thought it was a useless piece of paper. "The claim is legal," Jeb said. "The spring is yours. The water, it's yours." "What does Mr. Croft want?" Ilara asked, her voice shaking with the relief. Jeb finally looked at her. "He wants to buy your water." The world tilted. He's a hard man, ma'am, but he's not a stupid one. His herd is worth a fortune, and they're thirsty. He's prepared to offer you a contract." Jeb reached into the wagon bed. He did not pull out a gun or a deed of foreclosure. He pulled out a side of bacon, a 50-pound sack of flour, a bag of coffee. "He offers trade," Jeb said, "for access. 10 barrels of water a week. In exchange, the Sea-Bar Ranch will supply your provisions for the winter." Ilara looked at the food. It was more than she'd seen in a year. It was survival. It was safety. "And," Jeb said, his voice dropping, he has instructed me to help you, to properly shore up the spring, build a cistern, a real one. To protect his investment, he says." Ilara looked at the bacon, then at her children, who were peering from the window, their eyes as big as saucers. She looked at Jeb, a man who had pitied her, who now looked at her as an equal. She thought of Croft, furious, defeated by a piece of paper and a mother's desperation. He wasn't just buying water, he was paying for her silence. He was paying for the fact that she, and she alone, now had the power to destroy his monopoly or to sell to him. She had chosen the latter. "You can tell Mr. Croft," Ilara said, her voice clear and strong in the cold November air, "that his terms are acceptable for now." "And one more thing, ma'am," Jeb said, flushing. He asks if you'd be willing to sell him any of them squash." The Prairie Fire of 1887 was remembered in the county as the Great Devastation. It wiped out 3 homesteads, destroyed thousands of acres of grazing land, and solidified Silas Croft's monopoly on the valley. Except it didn't. A year passed. The land was still scarred, but life, as it always does, was returning. Small green shoots pushed up through the black. And on the Hayes homestead, life was not just returning, it was thriving. The spring, now encased in a professionally built stone cistern, complete with a lockable iron lid, bubbled away, its water still warm, still sweet. Jeb and a team from the Sea-Bar Ranch, working under the watchful eye of Ilara, had not only secured the spring, but had also dug a proper irrigation ditch, channeling the overflow into the hidden ravine. That ravine, once Ilara's secret, was now her legacy. It was a long, green scar of life in the gray prairie. It was filled with rows of corn, beans, squash, and potatoes. A small, sturdy cabin, built of real wood, part of her contract with Croft, now sat near the entrance to the ravine, a fortress of security. Thomas, now 10, was no longer a gaunt, fearful boy. He was strong, quiet, and he ran the irrigation ditches with an engineer's precision. May, her cheeks permanently rosy, tended to a flock of chickens that pecked happily in the damp, rich soil of the canyon. Alara had changed most of all. The gaunt, desperate widow was gone. In her place was a formidable woman. She was a landowner, a water baron, a businesswoman. She still wore her simple dresses, but they were clean. Her hands were calloused, but from building, not from begging. Silas Croft still ran the valley, but it was a partnership now, not a dictatorship. His cattle were fat, watered by a steady, reliable stream from the Hayes Spring, for which he paid dearly in supplies, lumber, and, most importantly, respect. He would ride by once a month to inspect his investment. He and Alara would stand by the cistern, two monarchs surveying their shared kingdom. They never spoke of the fire. They never spoke of the day he had dragged her from her cabin. They spoke of futures, of rainfall, of the price of beef in Chicago. The fire had not been a curse. It had been a crucible. It had burned away the superficial, the impossible dreams of Daniel's wheat fields. It had burned away her weakness, her despair. It had forced her down to the rock, and in the rock she had found her foundation. She had been a widow, starving on barren land, waiting for a miracle. The land hadn't changed. The sky hadn't changed. The miracle hadn't been the water. The miracle had been the fire, the event that had revealed the strength that was in her, and in the land, all along. The frontier was an unforgiving place, demanding strength that many never knew they possessed. Alara's story is a testament to the resilience hidden just beneath the surface, waiting for a spark to reveal it. These whispers from the old world are all around us, in the land, in our families, and in the stories we tell. If you want to hear more tales of survival, of hidden secrets, and of the unyielding human spirit, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, Old World Whispers. We have a new story for you every week. Thank you for listening.